All right, let's move on to the next study session item on B.
Item 7B, conduct a study session and provide direction regarding a draft ordinance with amendments to San Bruno Municipal Code Title 12 Land Use Article 3 Zoning to amend and replace Chapter 12.100 Off-Street Parking and Loading, amend Chapters 12.92, 12.96, and 12.200 and Parking Design Standards Resolution.
Where's my PowerPoint? Sorry, tech's on it. Good evening, Honorable Mayor and members of the City Council. My name's Darcy Smith. I'm the Community and Economic Development Director, and I'm here tonight with a study session before you to seek your direction regarding the draft parking ordinance and draft resolution with the parking design standards. I'll be providing a quick introduction with the city's lead contractor on this effort, Kelly Beggs from Good City Company. Also in attendance tonight on the project team are Pamela Wu, the Planning and Housing Manager, Aaron Aikman, the Principal from Good City Company, and Jason Moody, the Managing Principal from Economic and Planning Systems. And additionally, I'd also like to acknowledge other key staff. This was very much a group effort from Public Works Department and also the City Engineer, Mark Zafrano. So I wanted to set the stage for this by covering the objective, and the main objective is to get an update and provide direction on this item, but I wanted to emphasize the breadth of this because it was about a year ago that we came before you and discussed the Transit Quarter Plan parking standards. The next night, we had a community town hall to discuss parking, and we raised the concept of developing new strategies to increase off-street parking stalls in residential neighborhoods, which was a key interest of the community. Next, you adopted the Downtown Parking Management Plan, which identified the long-term strategy of providing a downtown parking garage and in part through new parking in lieu fees paid for by development. And that was key in the interest of downtown revitalization. So I've touched on some of those objectives, but I think you'll see through the presentation the breadth of this undertaking, and staff spent a lot of time working on that and covering a wide variety of topics that I think touch on great value to both the residential and the business community. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kelly Beggs. She'll present the background and overview of the ordinance and resolution and end with summarizing the next steps and tonight's recommended council action where we're seeking input. Thank you.
Thank you, Darcy. I'm Kelly Beggs, Senior Planner with Good City Company, and I'm pleased to present the draft parking ordinance and parking design standards resolution to you tonight. I'll start with going over some background on the City of San Bruno's parking regulations. As Darcy mentioned, there's been no comprehensive code update in decades, but as you know, parking is a major issue and priority in the city. The existing code lacks major sections expected in a modern parking chapter as listed here. The current code also lacks regulation that implements parking policies included in the city's long-range planning documents. The ordinance before you this evening aims to resolve those issues, and this slide presents overarching goals of the proposed ordinance. The policies and regulations in the ordinance have been guided by council input, including the incorporation of more conservative parking standards for the transit corridors plans area. Regulations also include community feedback from the January 2019 town hall, and implementation of city plans and the housing element have also been a key goal of the ordinance update, especially as the city is required to implement certain housing element policies to maintain its housing element certification. Regarding the housing element, the ordinance will specifically implement Housing Element Program 3H by updating residential parking standards pursuant to state density bonus law requirements, and also by allowing tandem parking to satisfy parking requirements for residential and employee parking spaces citywide. Relevant policies of the general plan, the TCP, and the housing element are summarized in detail in attachment 5 to your staff report. The Planning Commission did review the draft ordinance and resolution at their December 17th meeting, and they unanimously voted to recommend City Council approval. 3 key areas of discussion for your consideration were allowing unbundled parking for development in neighborhoods that have residential parking permit programs, allowing tandem parking for customers of businesses if valet assistance is provided, and allowing businesses to use the parking in lieu fee for all or a higher percentage of the required off-street parking. Attachment 3 further summarizes Planning Commission comments. Now, with that context in mind, I'll move on to presenting the proposed ordinance. The proposed ordinance aims to provide clear, consistent, and updated parking standards that implement past direction of City Council, protect quality of life in the City of San Bruno, and facilitate economic investment in the city. The ordinance applies to new construction, enlargements to existing buildings, and changes of land uses in existing buildings. It will amend and replace Municipal Code Chapter 12.100 and amend Chapters 12.92, .96, and .200. The amendments in 12.92, 96, and 200 of the Municipal Code are intended to resolve conflicts between the proposed ordinance and the existing Municipal Code, and also to consolidate all of the parking regulation into one section. Now I'll move on to the key features of the ordinance. An important note here is that the scope of this ordinance is to regulate off-street parking and loading, which means parking and loading located outside of the public right-of-way. In the image on the screen, you can see 3 different formats of parking. There's on-street parking on the large street to the left of the intersection. There's a surface parking lot, and there's a wrapped garage. Likely this ordinance would only apply to the wrapped garage and the surface street parking, not to any on-street. The ordinance regulates minimum vehicle, motorcycle, scooter, and bicycle parking spaces based off of floor area and land use, as well as off-street vehicle loading. The landscaping requirements are set forth for parking areas, and transportation demand management and parking management requirements are included. This slide reviews the main objectives of the ordinance. The proposed ordinance includes organized and updated standards designed to be both business and resident friendly, and includes regulation that aims to increase off-street parking for residential areas, revitalize the downtown, and implements the policies of the city's long-range planning documents as previously discussed. I'll go through how the ordinance addresses these objectives in the following slides. To start with the resident and business focus, the ordinance includes a user-friendly and reorganized parking requirement table, which I'll show in the following slides. It includes strategies to increase single-family off-street parking, special provisions for the use of transportation demand management to reduce vehicle trips and parking demand in specific plan areas, small business exemptions to encourage the establishment of businesses downtown, and lastly, it allows for flexible parking configuration, meaning tandem, mechanical, and automated requirements to maximize parking supply within constrained sites. This slide shows the required citywide off-street parking for residential land uses, which have been revised to be consistent with council direction regarding more conservative TCP standards and to be consistent with state density bonus law. This next slide shows the required off-street parking for major non-residential land uses. As you can see, one category on the leftmost column covers multiple similar land uses in the middle column. The number of required parking spaces is shown on the rightmost column and sets forth the number of spaces required per square feet of floor area. I will note that projects located in specific plan areas, such as the TCP area, can reduce off-street parking by 10% with implementation of a TDM plan and a parking management plan. They can also further potentially reduce off-street parking up to 30% with the in lieu fee, which I'll describe later in this presentation. Moving on to Objective 2, this slide outlines strategies to increase supply of off-street parking in residential areas. Many older homes in San Bruno cannot fit a modern vehicle in the existing garages and driveways, and these strategies aim to remedy that issue. The bulleted strategies would allow property owners with non-conforming garages and driveway depths to bring those elements up to code, to fit a modern vehicle and reduce demand for on-street parking and allow residents to park their vehicles on their properties. The illustration to the right shows you what an uncovered front yard parking exception could look like. In this instance, it would include increasing the driveway width in the front yard to increase the parking area to allow 2 vehicles to fit there. The parking area could be provided as shown on this image, or it could also be provided in an angled configuration if the front setback of the home were to be shallower. Here are some other real examples of these options in action. The top 2 images show the widened driveway similar to the illustration in the previous slide. The bottom 2 show recessed garage doors that would allow an uncovered parking space in the driveway. So those driveways would be too short without the recess. Next, I'll move on to the economic revitalization objective. These include the Central Business District small business exemptions and then also the in lieu fee. So the Central Business District exemption applies to buildings constructed prior to 2005 in the CBD district, which is shown in the thick black outline with the red hatched fill. Property owners in these older buildings have paid into a parking assessment district, which has existed from the late 1980s to the mid-2000s, and they have funded the existing surface parking lots downtown. With this exemption, no additional off-street parking or in lieu fee would be required for the first 2,500 square feet of any change of use to a more intensive use. So for example, that would be a retail space to a gym or a retail space to a cafe potentially. This provision is intended to encourage the establishment of small businesses in existing vacant and underutilized buildings downtown. The next economic revitalization item is the parking in lieu fee. The parking in lieu fee is supported by multiple planning documents, but was most explicitly analyzed in the Downtown Parking Management Plan. The purpose of the in lieu fee is to consolidate parking downtown rather than requiring it by piece of land, and it's to fund a downtown garage. And this would represent a major investment of approximately $22 million, and which would require additional planning and engineering analysis to actually build the garage. The in lieu fee would apply to non-residential land uses located in specific plan areas. Property owners could pay the fee in lieu of providing the off-street parking for up to 30% of required spaces. And an example of the project is detailed below in the bottom left corner. In this instance, the in lieu fee would allow a property owner to reduce retail parking from 17 spaces to 12 spaces on site, and they would pay the in lieu fee for 5 of the required spaces. I'll note that the fee cannot be used to reduce residential parking requirements. This slide presents the recommended fee amounts for different specific plan areas. The city has hired economic and planning systems to study the fee amount, and preliminary analysis has shown that a fee of $2,500 to $25,000 is feasible for projects in the TCP area. A fee of $60,000 per space is feasible for the Bay Hill specific plan area, and that's due to the higher land values there and also the much elevated cost of constructing underground parking. As you can see for the TCP area, as a sliding scale ranging from $2,500 per space to $10,000 per space is recommended, and a uniform fee of $60,000 per space is recommended for the Bay Hill specific plan area. Staff is requesting feedback on the fee tonight, so I'll be happy to come back to this slide during discussion, and economic planning system staff is also here to respond to questions. The last item in this presentation is the parking design standards resolution. The parking design standards have been separated into a resolution, and that's in order to facilitate updating standards that more frequently change due to technological innovation and shifting industry practices. The resolution includes dimensions for parking spaces, driveways, and aisles, and design standards for items like lighting, surfacing, striping, and screening. It also specifies operational performance standards specific to mechanical and automated parking requirements. These mechanical parking structures are seeing widespread use in the Bay Area, and they do allow you to provide more parking within a smaller footprint and efficiently used space. The performance standards for mechanical and automated parking cover items like maintenance, inspection, and availability of vehicles, and that's in order to ensure that these structures are functional and long-lasting, similar to traditional surface parking. In conclusion, City Council is requested to provide direction to staff on the proposed ordinance and parking design standards resolution. This slide presents the next steps. The target adoption date is early 2020, which will allow staff to include this accomplishment in the housing element progress report. And this concludes my presentation. I'm available to answer any questions that you may have, as is the city and consultant team. Thank you.
Thank you for your report. Anything else, Darcy? So to council, we can either start here, but we do have, I believe, 5 speaker cards of folks that would like to address or what have you. So is there any immediate questions from council at this time? No? Why don't we go ahead? We're going to allow the public to come up, and then we'll hear what they say, and then we'll take some notes.
Tom Hamilton, followed by Allison Warner.
Good evening. As you heard, the Planning Commission approved this unanimously. I would encourage the council to do the same. There are provisions in here, as you saw, there's many pieces of this are critical that we get into the code, all the missing pieces of the ordinance that we do not have. But especially the provision for the downtown revitalization, the provisions for the first 2,500 square feet of businesses to be exempt from off-site parking requirements is really going to help our downtown businesses. As you know, we have businesses that cannot open because of the current provisions. This will help them immediately. I would strongly recommend that you adopt this as soon as possible. If there are things that you feel that are missing that would want to add, I would still say adopt this and then go after those things later, rather than hold everything up trying to add additional things, because we know how that can happen. So I just want to reiterate what the Planning Commission has already sent throughout their comments. There were comments regarding, well, I don't want to go into that. I think I'm good. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Tom.
Allison Warner, followed by Dean Moser.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, staff. I'm Allison Warner. I'm with Regency Centers. We own the Bay Hill Shopping Center in the Bay Hill specific plan area. So first, I'd just like to thank you all for your efforts as you approach this ordinance. I think that I recognize it's definitely intended to be forward-thinking, and I think that the efforts to revitalize downtown are fantastic. I just personally have a few concerns. Forgive me if I read. I kind of have a bit to say. It was quite a long ordinance to read through. So I have a few concerns over some of the overly restrictive components, such as how to count the mechanical parking spaces, for example, as well as the inequitable application of the in lieu fees to the specific plan areas relative to the rest of the city. As an owner of a retail shopping center, the one thing I would strongly caution is the city passing the ordinance that's overly restricted and inadvertently results in the ability to innovate and respond to market needs as we move forward. So as a retail owner, I obviously know that land use very well, and I know how much parking impacts the success of that. So I'd just like to quickly walk through an example of what this ordinance would do to our property alone. So changing the use from retail to services results in a 17% increase in parking. Understandable. Changing it to food and beverage results in a 200% increase in the parking requirements, yet the opportunity to pay in lieu fees is restricted to 30%. Quickly run through this, I have a minute and a half left. So given that we're restricted on land, and we all know that land is a scarce resource and that there's already a significant requirement for stormwater quality control on our property, there's also the addition of the 10% of a parking area landscape requirement that's being added. Suddenly the ability to add the number of parking spaces required on a finite amount of land is becoming more and more and more difficult. I think that the ability to consider more efficient parking options on a retail property becomes even more complicated because tenants often have significant control over what we can or can't do. So just adding a garage to make up the difference is not always an option. So the ability to innovate and add things like parking stackers and places that make more sense where tenants allow us is great. I just then have concern with the amount of parking stackers that we're allowed to add, or how exactly they're counted, and is that the right way to count them? I think that alternative transportation methods offering TDMs are all fantastic, and I'm in full support of that component of the ordinance, but I will also caution that we're still learning how customers are using these new options like Uber and Lyft and Razor scooters. But it's difficult to buy your groceries and Razor scooter home. So again, just being thoughtful in how customers use different land uses. So I would just urge you to carefully consider the lack of flexibility in certain components to allow landowners to respond to changing demands over the coming years across all land uses, and consider a more equitable application across the entire city of things such as in lieu fees. So thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Dean Moser, followed by Andrew Turco.
Good evening, Council. My name is Dean Moser, and I represent the owners of 801-851 Traeger. And I'd like to thank you for your consideration in being a little flexible in the mitigation fees. But I'm wondering if I heard correctly, it doesn't apply to residential. So if I wanted to build residential on that space, does that mean that I don't get that flexibility in the 30% reduction in actual parking spaces? Maybe they can answer that question here in a bit. But I'm also wondering how you arrived at a $60,000 value per parking space if we mitigate, when it's $10,000 at the most for anywhere else in the city. And also in the report it shows that to build a parking structure downtown, it might cost you $35,000 or $40,000 for a space. So how does Bay Hill get to be $60,000? And as a property owner in Bay Hill, I don't know what good a parking facility down in the city, 10 minutes away, would help me if I have to pay, to build that facility. So just a couple of those questions. How'd you get the value, when at 60,000, when it costs 35 to 40,000 according to your report, and everybody else pays 10,000. So, and then does it apply to the residential if I were to build residential there? Thank you.
Dean. Next speaker, please.
Andrew Turco, followed by Ken Ibarra. Okay. Ken Ibarra.
Andrew passes, and Ken Ibarra is up.
Do I get his time? Honorable Mayor and Council, I'm Ken Ibarra. I've been an architect for 35 years. Parking is determined by uses and amounts that are outlined in the municipal code. My challenge, nearly on every project, is calculating in square footage. I have dealt with staff in many municipalities in the peninsula over how they calculate parking. And when I look at this a new ordinance, and I in favor of a lot of the changes, I still look at the table of what's required for parking, and in some cases it's gross floor area of a building. In some cases it's broken down, and the example that you give, retail to restaurant, and I was happy to see on the presentation that that there was some calculation for just the public area, but in many cases the calculation is for the entire building. Now obviously we know in a restaurant that there is space for the dining public, there's a large space for a kitchen, and then there's also storage and restrooms. And I'd like to see, possibly if that is being done in staff, I'd like to see it documented. There is no, I don't find anything in this ordinance that states how we calculate parking, how we calculate the spaces. So I'm hoping that that happens. I also like, as far as residential, I've always been in favor of San Bruno's dealing with residential parking because of residential additions and remodels. Just want to make sure that the use permit process will still be maintained, and that also the ideas of being able to park more open space parking on your front yard is still allowed and taken in consideration. We still have a lot of one-car garages in San Bruno, but we do have a lot of families that want to add family space. So I'm hoping that there is some consideration with that. I think I've covered everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Is there anybody else in the audience that wanted to speak on this topic? If not, then we'll bring it to council. Questions? Comments?
Yes, can we get the questions
Well,
addressed?
if council wants to have certain things asked, then you guys can go ahead and tackle that, unless the city manager wants to address anything specific.
I think it'd be best if we address council questions.
Let's start with the very last comment made by
Perfect.
Mr. Ibarra about the calculation of retail space. I mean, how really is that calculated?
Hi, so I'm happy to respond to this question. I would direct the member of the public to the definitions section. So we paid very careful attention to the definitions that follow the chapter. And so the definition of floor area is located in the definition section, and also the definition of public floor area that specifies exactly what you should be counting towards your parking requirement.
Do we want to ask the next question, which is the $60,000 question?
As long as it's coming from council.
Yeah, so I'll ask the question. The
Sure, that'd be great.
report refers to parking spaces, I believe, as 35 to 45,000.
Yes, of course.
Right, and I think at 22 million, you're at 55,000. And I know from other things that I've read, parking spaces could go up to 80,000 per parking space. So if you could just talk a little bit about
Sure.
how you get
So I
that
will-
calculation.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll bring APS up here because they're far more knowledgeable than I. But I will point out that it is $60,000 per stall is our estimate right now.
Yeah. There are two questions that are being asked. One is about the calculation for what it costs to build a parking structure downtown. And then the other question is, why is there a difference between the Bay Hill Office Park in Luffy and the in Luffy elsewhere? The first question Kelly just provided the answer to, which is the math is $60,000 a space in downtown. And so in the PowerPoint, it was a $22 million garage estimate for a 370 space garage. That's roughly $60,000 a space. What I think council is also remembering, in the downtown parking study, there was an initial estimate that was lower in the $30,000 to $40,000 per space. The cost to construct a parking space varies based on the site constraints, based on the size, based on whether you're going subterranean. But in general, what we're estimating is for an above ground parking space of for a garage of 250 and above, you're really looking at a cost of anywhere from $40,000 to $65,000 per space, and it just all matters on the property. And so there are other considerations of what it costs to go subterranean and building types, and what is before you is a slide that we thought was a little too detailed to go through initially, but we did want to have it sort of as a pocket slide, thinking this question will come up. So I want to ask Jason from EPS to come up and walk us through this slide, because that'll give the city council and members of the public a window into the deep analysis that went into the setting of the fee. And I think Jason and/or I will expound upon other points later.
Thank you. My name is Jason Moody. I'm Managing Principal at Economic and Planning Systems. I think Javon did a perfectly fine job of answering the question about the cost of a parking garage and how we got to that number, so I won't elaborate on that one. What we also did at this part of this analysis is to try to get a sense of how the in lieu fee option might affect the development feasibility of various types of real estate projects. And we looked at a number of different types of real estate projects. One would just be taking a retail and making it a restaurant, change of use. Then the other one would be looking at a vacant retail site, so it's retail but it's vacant, and then you make it a restaurant. And then we look at a 4-story, a 5-story, and so on down the line. Those are the different types of projects we looked at. They all are what I would call prototypes. They're very generic, and for the purpose of this analysis, we can't obviously evaluate every potential project that might be there. So we have to make assumptions about how much the land would cost, for example, and what can feasibly be developed on a relatively generic, normally shaped site. And so we went through that, and I guess the big findings that we found is that obviously the fee helps everything because it gives you an option that you don't currently have. So the fee does not hurt any project at all. It provides more flexibility. So the fee is over from an economic perspective a good thing. In some cases, the fees actually will allow a project that might not be feasible to be feasible. So you wouldn't be able to do it but for the fee. In other cases, it may not improve the feasibility. The project's not likely to be feasible anyway, and adding the fee flexibility doesn't shift the needle enough, particularly because you're only allowing for 30%. If that number went up more, so you could in lieu out at more than 30%, you may flip the needle on some of these projects, but with a 30% for some of them, you won't. And then the office in Bay Hill, we looked at office in Bay Hill. We didn't look at the retail conversion of a retail shopping center. It was primarily at office that we looked at. In that case, and I think someone said earlier, building a underground parking structure is what is required in Bay Hill is pretty expensive proposition. So to the extent that the fee is providing a benefit, a flexibility, it's something that would make improve feasibility. Now we already know that the YouTube is going forward with their project, so that would suggest that it's feasible to some degree. So this isn't making that more infeasible because it's already feasible and it's just another option. So we can go and talk about each one of these different prototypes, if you will, further about how the fee affects it. But you can kind of see green is feasible, red is infeasible, marginal is kind of depend on how much they bought the land for. And so that's a summary of that chart.
It's also important to note that the use of the in lieu fee is completely discretionary, and this ordinance provides it as an option, but it would have to be approved at whatever level the project or the modification is being approved at. Most often, likely the Planning Commission. Sometimes if there's a discretionary approval tied to the project, it will come to the City Council. And so when staff reviews these and makes the recommendation to those bodies, we will be looking at a whole host of things, which is what will be the impact of allowing that in lieu fee, even though there's the possibility of a 10% fee waiver with a transit demand management plan, and then an additional fee out of up to 20%. That's not a guarantee for any project. And when we talk about retail, and in particular when we talk about Bay Hill, we will certainly be looking at the potentiality for impacted parking, and we may make the determination that we do not favor a fee out for retail space in Bay Hill. I think we all know how impacted the parking at the Bay Hill office shopping center is right now. And if they add residential, there would not be the ability to fee out for the residential portion. And so it's not a fait accompli. There will be analysis and there will be discretionary approval.
other council members? Linda?
I wanted to ask about I think it's in attachment 3. I just have my written notes, but there's a comment about the customer parking can be tandem, and then I guess there was a comment or a request from maybe the business owners about valet parking, and I wanted to expand on that idea a little bit.
Sure, so that's the summary of the Planning Commission hearing that you're referring to.
Thank you.
So the ordinance as it is does not allow tandem parking for either visitor parking for the residential or for customer parking for non-residential uses. And the rationale behind that is just that it would be very difficult for people who aren't in an organization together to be able to coordinate removal of a tandem parking space if you're the first one in. And then that did come up at Planning Commission. There was a member of the public who was interested in using tandem for customer parking, and the Planning Commission did ask that we bring this to you for consideration if they provided valet, if they could be allowed.
I think it's worth thinking about, to be quite honest, considering our parking situation. I also wanted to just get clarity on, and I think we've already spoken about it a little bit, or a lot, but I do want to get clarity on the residential. So there's, in the Bay Hill specific plan, so it sounds like there's the ability to relieve up to 10% of the parking restriction. Is that right? And then they can go all the way up to 30%?
So it's up to 10%, so this is only for non-residential land uses, I'll point out, so not for residential land uses. But for non-residential land uses, they can use a TDM plan that demonstrates that they've reduced their trip generation by 10% in order to receive the 10% reduction in parking spaces. The in lieu fee could be used for an additional 20%, but they cannot go above 30% total. So they can combine those two reductions, but not exceed 30%.
And who would approve whether they can use the in lieu fee or not?
That would be the decision-making body.
Okay. This is a question for Darcy in regards to the small business exception. I'm just curious, how many denials occur because of the parking situation in downtown?
So I don't think we've had straight denials, but we often get customers who come to the city's public service counter and ask about vacant spaces or spaces that might be occupied by a use, which on the parking table has a lower demand requirement. So you heard Mr. Ibarra say, well, there's some that require a lot, and hold on, let me find this table. There's some uses that require a lot more parking, and there's some that require a lot less. And typically, restaurant uses are high parking demand uses, and then entertainment and services, so a fitness club, for example, or a massage establishment, or personal services like a hair salon or a beauty salon require a little bit more. And then the lowest parking requirement is general retail. And traditionally in our downtown, it was more of a retail downtown, but it's shifted like many downtowns, right? Think of all the successful downtowns on the peninsula. There's been a shift from a more retail downtown to a restaurant or personal services downtown. And this is just the evolution, right? The malls are the center of the retail uses. And so that's a barrier, because right now what our parking chapter says is that if there's a change in use, you have to provide the parking and you have to provide it on site. There's no in lieu fee, there's no exemption, there's no relief. And that has definitely been a barrier to the city staff saying to a potential business tenant, such as a restaurant or a personal service use, or we've had inquiries from health clubs, small health studios, I should say, wanting to go into the downtown. And we've also had this at the Bay Hill Center, too. And we've had to tell them, I'm sorry, but you can't go into this space. So staff took that direct feedback and that barrier into consideration in drafting this, and also the research that we did about the history behind the downtown parking lots and how they were funded through a district, and just trying to model what other successful cities have done in their downtown, right? We We know that other successful cities have built structures, and that provides that public parking for the downtown, and that's the ultimate goal. But I think we need to do something in the near term. And, we've talked to some business owners at the Planning Commission. We got some feedback from business owner and property owner who were trying to make a site work that had the same initial answer. And I will let you know we continue to work through with those businesses to try to facilitate them moving into those spaces. And this will be a really important tool to help us be successful.
How will if approved, how will this impact existing projects?
Well, so we have educated this widely to the development community. That's in part why you had the members of that community here tonight. And we actually started educating many big developers about a year ago when you had that first study session and provided us with feedback on the transit corridor plan parking standards. And we held projects to that have been going through the project, and we've been consistently educating those development projects. So for projects that are in the pipeline right now, where there haven't been any approvals, as soon as these are adopted, they go into effect and they're held to those. But we've been gearing up the education piece and educating them to ensure that these are met. And again, that's why you see the audience here tonight. But for any existing approvals, such as the aperture or any past approvals, those approvals stand, and they could only be modified through a process that's a formal process. So when projects are approved, they're approved with the codes that are in effect at that time and the parking requirements that are in effect at that time. And there's a process that's discretionary they could go through to modify that, but it is a city process, and we retain discretion.
Mayor?
Thank you.
Marty.
We just wanted to make sure we answered the question from the public. So for the residential,
Go ahead, ask. Well,
My question really was, it doesn't apply to residential, then I don't get any of the 10% or the 20%.
I'll answer that. So we deliberately did not want to initially, with a brand new in lieu fee program, include a use that we thought would need to meet an on-site parking requirement, which is residential. And traditionally, this in lieu fee has been used for non-residential uses, as I mentioned, where there's a parking garage, the city plans on building one. But that said, for this particular property on Traeger, it is my understanding that they have a surface parking lot that provides office parking that would then be built upon to provide a residential project. So that surface parking for the office would need to be replaced somewhere. And for example, that component in the replacement of that could utilize the in lieu fee. But the residential, our policy proposal to you is to require it on site, because the downtown parking garage is really meant to cater to visitors and employees of businesses.
And it's important to note that the city recently increased the parking standards, and that the plan for that is to be codified with this ordinance. And so, for example, going to approximately 1 parking space per bedroom, there was a lot of talk and consideration around that, and providing an in lieu fee would potentially water that down.
I'm sorry.
I just had one comment. In the report, it mentioned the unbundled parking, and that would be like on a case-by-case basis. But I don't like unbundled, because I just see where, new developments will eventually start to sell the parking at an additional cost. And when you can't afford rent as it is, that's one more thing that you're not going to pay for. So I'm always concerned when parking doesn't come that's required with the complex. So that's just a comment.
Marty.
to our first question about the concerns about the mechanical stackers, what's the concern and what's the answer? Like, I'm not sure.
Sure. So in the draft regulations, we allow for up to 50% of mechanical parking with a non-valet, and then up to 55% with a valet assist. One of the things that, this is a study session, and so these are not final recommendations, but we've had a lot of conversations and issues have been raised around, well, if you can get 50% without valet, just getting an additional 5% by incurring the expense of a valet may not be that beneficial. And one of the things we want to do, because we know that these mechanical systems are constantly improving and the design of them are constantly improving, is we want to allow flexibility. And so we are having internal discussions about raising that with valet assist up to 75%. Knowing that it will have to be a discussion and an agreement. One of the things that is a concern is ensuring that the parking spaces, frankly, are large enough to fit the vehicles that people are driving. And so looking at the vehicle mix and studies on that may be something that we look at when we increase the volume higher than from 55% going to 75%. But we want to be able to provide an incentive for mechanical parking, and we absolutely want to make it be something that is appropriate for the user. And one of the things about mechanical lifts is that what really matters is how long it takes me to get my car in and out. And you take away that the queuing time of people driving around, but there's a limit to how long people think is appropriate to sit and wait for this high-tech thing to bring my car down. And so we just want to really look into that, but we think moving from 55 to 75 would be appropriate. And so when we come back with the final recommendations, that very well may be in there.
Was there anything else? Because you have the experience, and it's more important that your questions are answered. And you guys have been talking, and can you go back to the mic? I'm sorry, so we can get your response.
Not a problem. Happy to hear that you're considering a higher percentage for valet, because I absolutely agree that that type of system is more utilized when there's the service provided with it. I think the other half of my question was more related to how it's counted, and whether or not both the surface parking and the stacked car above should truly both be considered within that 75%, or if just the mechanical component that's stacking should be counted towards the percentage.
Sure, we'd have to get out a whiteboard. But we think going to 75% allows for an appropriate use of stackers, and the methodology that we're proposing of counting both the bottom space and the top space as being in the stacked unit works. And so this is a study session. We will continue to have conversations with stakeholders, but I think to describe the methodology, we had various models up on the board this afternoon.
And going along with that, regarding the other stakeholders, that are there more people that were engaged with talking about these stackers and in general, or no? People generally wait till they come to the counter and then.
Well, so just a little bit of background. The City Council did approve a project with mechanical parking lifts at 111 San Bruno. That was the first, to my knowledge, and it has not started construction yet, but we are working through that in the building permit plan check stage. And there's a lot of intricate details, such as fire sprinklers. How does it work for the car on the bottom, for example, to ensure if that car catches fire that it gets extinguished, because there's blockage with the lifts. But we have support from the fire department and from the building division to move forward, which is a key stakeholder too. But we have not had conversations with other developers about utilizing this that have been finalized, that we're ready to present. But I will say we want to finalize the requirements in place and ensure that they can be met, because sometimes valet assistance can be feasible, such as for a big shopping center or YouTube or a big office tenant, but it may not be feasible for a smaller project.
Got it.
So at this point, we're not processing any applications with mechanical parking, but it is something that more developers are looking to, especially within parking garages, to it just increases parking, and you can see from the picture here, you can really be more efficient with your layout.
Right. And Darcy is correct. We are not working outside of the people that have spoken tonight and that are active locally with projects that want to do them. We have had companies that manufacture and implement these systems, talk to us about them and review our regulations and provide comment. And so that feedback loop is happening.
Got it. And then there was another comment about the amount of landscaping. Is there a?
I can answer that question. So there was a comment about flexibility with the landscaping provisions, and we are introducing new landscaping provisions that we feel are appropriate, but there is an exception indicated for people who really demonstrate hardship in meeting the required off-street parking and providing the landscaping. There is a way for you to demonstrate hardship and reduce that requirement.
So I think we have all the questions answered from the public, hopefully, everybody. Sorry.
Yes.
I was just working my way back up, because normally you're really good. You kind of go through there.
I know staff is kind of wanting me to keep the study sessions on track, so because of last time
with
with the time element.
Got it.
But thank you. I appreciate it.
So the big thing here, how does, if you can explain again, and maybe it's just I'm not clicking it tonight, how it's $60,000 up in Bay Hill that somebody would pay to put a parking garage in downtown? That's where that money's going?
Well,
And it just seems kind of, if I was over there, I'd be like, how's that benefiting me? So go ahead.
The in lieu fee money would go into a fund. A portion of that could support a downtown parking garage, which has been expressed by this community and this city as a need. I think your other question is, what is the rationale and the basis for the in lieu fee? The basis for the in lieu fee is in part the analysis that Jason went through, but it's also making sure the fee is lower than the cost to construct a subterranean space in Bay Hill, but not too low where there's a fee out and essentially the city is making it extremely advantageous to not provide parking and to fee out. And so the purpose of an in lieu fee is to have it be a fee that will be paid because it is cheaper than the next alternative, but not too low where you provide a significant incentive to fee out. And so as Jason's analysis showed, there's a significant difference between what it costs to construct an above-ground parking space in downtown versus what it costs to construct a subterranean space in Bay Hill or elsewhere in the city where you have to do subterranean. It's also important to note that the reason why there are lower fees in the downtown and for small businesses is that is a policy option that the city council has, and part of the recommendations has the city council taken advantage of that ability to say, you know what, we do want to have some economic development initiatives as a part of this fee setting methodology, and we have businesses that can expand, and so having a small business exemption and having reduced fees in our central business district that has small footprint businesses is a policy objective that we want to further, and so we're willing to have reduced in lieu fees there.
Got that. If I can follow up then with the 2,500 square foot exemption, how many of the businesses that are currently in San Bruno downtown, it would seem like most of them would be okay with not, I mean, that's free parking at 2,500 square feet, right? So how many of the outliers that need that additional space do we have?
Extremely complicated analysis. It depends on the business. It depends on the use that they are in, that they want to change to. It depends on how much. You may have businesses that are not changing use. They just have extra square footage that they would like to take advantage of that they can't take advantage of now. It's really a case-by-case analysis, and so I can't say X number of businesses downtown would use this exemption.
Okay. I think that's all my questions.
I know you.
I got one more thing.
Yeah, please.
Sorry. So you mentioned the neighborhoods, there's a component there, and that widening the driveways is one thing, but not allowing an extension of the curb cut.
Oh, yes. So we're trying to prevent a loss of on-street parking. So we are going to analyze on a case-by-case basis as to whether or not that increase in curb cut would reduce the on-street parking, because the point of this initiative is really to increase overall supply.
Right. So as a former public works inspector here, I had to explain many, many times to residents why we wouldn't allow the curb cut to be extended, even though you can look, there's a 6-foot space between driveway to driveway, and why we couldn't allow them to extend the curb cut on that side, because you're never going to find a 6-foot car.
Yes. The other item that I would bring up related to your question is that those exemptions are going to be only available to residents that are in city council designated high impact areas.
Okay.
And that is part of the reason is that increasing impervious area has stormwater impacts.
Got it.
And there are also aesthetic impacts to undertaking some of these measures. So we do want to make sure that they're only being employed by people that are really in impacted areas.
Okay, so it is possible to extend that curb cut, because currently you cannot.
Yes, you can extend the curb cut, but you have to show that there's no net loss of on-street
Got it.
parking.
That's
So it'll
what-
be a really case-by-case
Got it.
basis
Okay.
as to kind of where your neighbor's curb cut is, basically.
Excellent, excellent, good. Thank you. That's it.
Michael?
Thank you. So I heard that there are going to be some changes to the landscaping requirements, but one of the comments I heard was where there are some requirements for the storm runoff in addition to what would be considered new landscape requirements. And so I'm wondering, is the storm runoff documented? Is that requirement documented somewhere else in our code? Because I know it's not, I didn't see it addressed in anything we had here.
So that's regulated under the C3 requirements, which is separate from the parking ordinance.
Okay,
Have
so that'll
Jimmy talk
remain.
about that.
But is there, or can there be some sort of an offset where if that's being addressed and it has helped to beautify and also protect the runoff, that it could be considered in
Yes.
place of?
So, sorry, to clarify though, the C3 is a regional stormwater requirement, not anywhere in the city code. And parking lot landscaping and those stormwater planters can be dual function.
And I also noticed that in this language, none of the landscaping would apply to remodels, only to new parking.
Correct. So a brand new surface lot,
parking. So
which-
not likely to happen anywhere in San Bruno that I can imagine.
That's correct.
So
'Cause
this probably wouldn't apply to anything.
As you've heard, the model now is typically underground parking with the building on top or a structured parking. Absolutely.
So what would be considered, so if there was a massive reconfiguration of streets and parking, I think that I would imagine would not fall under the, like say for example at Bay Hill, where there's a lot of parking, buildings are going to go there. I'm assuming that none of that existing surface parking, even if it's moved somewhere else or reconfigured, would really count as a remodel? Would that be considered a new surface parking?
The Bay Hill would be all underground, so it wouldn't be.
They're not talking about any surface parking there at all.
Right, but I will point out that there is section 12.100.080 does have requirements for tree planting along frontage of parking garages.
Of structures.
Of structures.
And that section is also very restrictive in that it says that you can't build them anywhere unless they're allowed by the voters or some other regulation. And so just to clarify, where would that be? I believe we have one area designated downtown that could potentially be a structure, and then anything else would be brand new and yet to be approved?
Yeah, I mean, potentially parts of Tanfran, maybe parts of the Naval Crossing development may have that unique characteristic.
Okay. Okay. All right, that was it. Thank you.
Linda?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if there's, I know part of this is to try to get in lieu fees to go towards a parking structure. Is there an update, I guess, on what's going on with meters?
The question is there an update on meters? So, in lieu fees is one mechanism that could go to fund a parking structure. One of the things we talked about, I think earlier in the fiscal year and around budget time, is that the city is looking into paid parking in downtown, both on-street and off-street. That work is still going on, and we are looking, part of the money that council approved for the fiscal sustainability project was to hire a parking consultant to take a look at what those fees should be for both the on-street and off-street. That work, the consultant has not been brought on board, but it is very much our intention to further that work because we do know from our downtown parking study that at times there is significant demand for parking and all of the on-street spaces are taken, and there are significant off-street spaces available in our city parking lots. And so one of the things cities do when they have people driving around is they introduce demand parking. And you make it a little cheaper to park in the garage than to park on street. And so you push people through demand pricing to where the available parking is versus having people continue to circle finding an on-street parking space, something that we are very much looking into. And depending on the level of the paid parking, depending on the revenue, there may be money from meters that can help pay debt service for a parking structure. I'm familiar with parking structures that have multiple funding sources. In lieu fee money that has accumulated in a fund, an ongoing revenue stream like parking meters, and you capitalize that and take on debt, and you use some of the parking revenue to pay back the debt. And so absolutely we are very much working to further the direction to obtain a parking structure downtown. And in lieu fee is just one bucket. Should developers ask to take advantage of it, and should it be approved because it's appropriate for that site, again, it's discretionary. It's one pot that could be used to help fund a parking structure. We are not looking at in lieu fees as a silver bullet to say this is how we're funding the parking structure. Okay.
Great. And then I just wanted to know, would this be the right document to mandate a percentage of the parking spaces to be for charging stations for electric vehicles?
So, no, that's covered under the building code. And they ramp them up and increase them very frequently. I think every 2 years they've been consistently ramping them up. So our document refers to that.
Okay, great.
But we have a special provision that says, for example, those don't count towards your parking requirement. So if you have EV chargers, they can count towards meeting the parking requirements that we discussed.
Okay, thank you.
So to staff, you were asking us about costs, if we had thoughts, correct? You want to pull that slide back up? You were also asking about unbundling tandems and park and lieu. As far as the unbundling, I have a concern with that as well, but it's nothing new for what I feel on that, because I think it ends up happening exactly with what Laura had said. But on the fees, what kind of feedback would you like from us, or do you want some direction, or no?
This is just a study session, a study session. The council should feel free to give feedback on anything that we presented. We will go back and finalize the staff recommendations and look forward to bringing those to you, I believe, in the month of, as soon as possible. So I doubt we can get it by the next meeting, but we will certainly do it as soon as possible.
Okay. Anything else from council? Okay. If not, thank you for the work. Thank you for being here.